So my name is Dina Khader, and I'm a private practice nutritionist here in Mount Kisco, New York, close to 30 years. And I shall be presenting reversing neurodegeneration with a plant-based approach. So as we can see with our first cartoon slide, the topic for this presentation will be Alzheimer's and the different forms of dementia. Statistics on Alzheimer's disease from the Alzheimer's Association. An estimated 1 in 10 people over the age of 65 is affected. And most of these are women, which are 2/3 of those who are diagnosed. It is the 6th leading cause of death in the United States. Life expectancy post-diagnosis is usually only 4 to 8 years. The cost of care for Alzheimer's disease and other dementias in the United States is estimated at $277 billion for 1 year, which was actually this year, 2018 alone. 1/3 of seniors die with Alzheimer's disease or another form of dementia. And currently, there are 7 million Americans who are living with dementia, and these are the statistics as of this year, 2018. So here is a general summary of the brain, as you can see. And, you know, the brain, of course, is a sophisticated, complex, and intricate system of hundreds of differing pathways that run through it. Our brain is highly sensitive to oxidative stress, heavy metal and chemical exposure, as these can cross the blood-brain barrier. The 3 major conditions that impact the brain negatively include inflammation, which is often caused by infection, hormonal and nutrient deficiencies, and also exposure to stress and environmental toxins. Many people who hear about Alzheimer's or know somebody in the family that have Alzheimer's are often thinking that it's related to genetics. And while that is true, the good news is that the gene for Alzheimer's, which is the APOE gene, apolipoprotein E, as it's often called, and it's the E3, which is what the majority of the population have. 75% of the population in the US does not have either an increased or a decreased risk of developing Alzheimer's disease. So that's really the good news. So that's 3/4 of the population. Whereas 15% of the population have the Alzheimer's gene, which is the APOE4, and this gives them an increased risk of developing Alzheimer's disease. It doesn't necessarily mean that you will have Alzheimer's, it just means that you have an increased risk. And 10% of the population can have the APOE2 gene, which means they actually have a decreased risk of developing Alzheimer's disease. In addition to genetic factors, the liver's ability to properly detox chemicals that we are exposed to, also lifestyle can affect or upregulate these harmful liver enzymes like the CYP1A1 gene and the cytochrome 450 gene, as well as the other genes and SNPs that are involved. We also have the methylation gene. Many of you have now had the opportunity to get that tested through your physician. The MTHFR gene, we know that if you have 1 copy from a parent, you have, a small risk of having an issue with methylation and being able to detox chemicals that you're exposed to in the environment. Whereas if you have 2 copies, 1 from each parent, you're at a significantly increased risk in having an issue with methylation. And typically the best form of methylation is either using hydrochloric acid supplements or folate, which is the tetrahydrofolate, methylfolate form of folic acid, not the straight folic acid, to help with this mutation. So let's take a look at some of the factors in more detail that negatively impact the health of our brain. We know that heavy metals, many of them are potent neurotoxins, mercury, for instance, lead, cadmium, and arsenic. The sources for these heavy metals would include water, soil, of course, food, and not to be forgotten, dental fillings, particularly the metal fillings, if they've not been replaced with the healthier porcelain type fillings. Also, air pollution is a significant factor in damaging the health of our brain. And these air pollutants would include sulfur dioxide, carbon monoxide, and ozone, which can actually inflame the arteries in the brain, potentially leading to strokes. Also, infections that get into the brain and cause brain inflammation have a significant impact on the health of our brain. Several strep infections, particularly in children, often referred to as PANDAS, pediatric autoimmune neuropsychiatric disorders, which are associated with frequent streptococcal infections, will increase the chances of causing brain damage later on in life. Epstein-Barr virus, many of us as practitioners are very familiar with that as being a causative factor with brain inflammation and brain fog. Hepatitis C, again, the liver connection with the brain. HIV/AIDS, West Nile virus, encephalitis, and of course, again, dental infections. And that's one of the reasons why it's very critical as practitioners that we really encourage our patients to take care of their teeth. So what are the symptoms of brain, inflammation or neuroinflammation, as we often call it, or the brain on fire? These are some examples of symptoms: brain fatigue and poor focusing after meals, brain fatigue that's promoted by chemicals, scents like perfumes, pollutants in the air, brain fatigue promoted by systemic inflammation. So if there's systemic inflammation going on in the body, that would be sufficient to trigger brain fatigue. Brain fog often from Lyme disease and fibromyalgia and candida. Those would be some examples of neuroinflammation. Low brain endurance, the ability not to be able to be particularly focused for long periods of time. Loss of brain function after any type of trauma to the body, slow and varied mental speeds, and then falling asleep, simply reading an article or a book, or even falling asleep at the dinner table. In more recent years, researchers have now come to understand that the brain is not an isolated organ. It is very closely tied to the gut. So we do have this brain-gut connection, and there's this feedback loop that occurs. So if somebody has gut issues, we as practitioners need to also look at the brain, at the health of the brain as well in those individuals, and vice versa. If there's a brain issue, we need to look at the health of the gut in those patients as well. So the brain dysfunction can impair gastrointestinal health, and then inflammatory responses in the gastrointestinal tract have neuroinflammatory consequences in the brain, and that leads to degeneration in the brain. In the gut, we have not only the nervous system, we also have an intestinal immune system, and this is often referred to the microglia cells, which we used to only think occurred or were produced in the brain, but now we understand that they are also produced in the gut, these immune cells. And they represent the first immune defense in the central nervous system. And also, of course, neurotransmitter health. Our brain is so dependent on the 4 major neurotransmitters, for instance, serotonin, dopamine, norepinephrine, and GABA. So if we were to look at these more specifically, serotonin assists in keeping us emotionally stable and our sleep and eating patterns consistent. Serotonin, surprisingly, is made more abundant in the intestinal tract than it actually is in the brain. Dopamine allows us to feel pleasure, process feelings, and care for others. Norepinephrine gives us the ability to be aroused and to have energy and drive. It controls our fight or flight instincts. And finally, GABA helps us control anxiety, impulsive behavior, and also helps us maintain a balanced thought process. And also now in recent years, researchers have started to realize that we also have a hormonal connection on the health of our brain and even in terms of brain aging. So these are some of the examples of hormones that occur in the brain. So we have, for instance, serotonin, which can contribute to the thickening of blood vessels and the formation of excess brain tissue as we age. One area that can impact serotonin levels, unfortunately, is what is often termed the serotonin syndrome. And this occurs when medications cause high levels of serotonin to be accumulating in the body. And a number of over-the-counter and prescription drugs can also create the serotonin syndrome. And these would include antidepressants as well as recreational drugs that can also affect the serotonin syndrome. Some forms of anti-migraine medications and also pain medications that include, codeine in them or some type of opioid medication will also create the serotonin syndrome as well. When there is an excess of serotonin, this will greatly contribute to brain inflammation, leading to a number of complications such as migraines, shock, and often neurological damage. So tryptophan, which is serotonin's precursor, is often marketed as an antidepressant. In the supplement form, 5-HTP is an example of that, but we now understand that when that's given in excess, that can also create the serotonin syndrome. So keeping that on the lower end with dosing is critical. We now know that DHEA is produced in the cerebral cortex and the hypothalamus. It also helps to produce the cytochrome P450, which really leads to androgen synthesis, and that in turn produces DHEA in the brain. Pregnenolone is a neurosteroid largely produced in the adrenal glands, in the gonads, and also in the brain, particularly the central nervous system. It is a hormone that has neuroprotective, neuroplastic, and neurogenesis benefits. It helps to regulate mood and is excellent for memory. Finally, the thyroid hormones are produced in the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland. Thyrotropin releasing hormone is secreted from the hypothalamus, whereas the thyroid stimulating hormone is secreted from the pituitary gland. Now, from a nutritional standpoint, let's take a look at foods that negatively impact brain health. We understand that excess sugar and starches are damaging to the brain. Fried foods are another source of insult to the brain. Gluten for many individuals. And the latest research is that at least 77% of the population in the US have some form of gluten sensitivity. So it's a really crazy high number of people that really may not be aware of their gluten sensitivity. Gluten mimicking and cross-reactive foods, we'll discuss that. Also non-organic foods, the partially hydrogenated fats, the polyunsaturated oils. The reason why the polyunsaturated oils specifically are damaging to the brain is that because they're highly unstable, they create more free radicals, and that in turn will damage healthy brain cells. The polyunsaturated oils also affect the thyroid negatively, leading to oxidation and are extremely toxic to the liver. And examples of these would be safflower oil, sunflower oil, and so on. Processed foods, we know also can be very damaging to the brain. Commercial red meat with all the hormones and antibiotics in the meat are damaging to our brains. Shellfish, and the reason behind the shellfish is really if somebody has a uric acid issue, like gout, for instance, then that in turn can cause brain inflammation as well. So when they have gout, they're not just having gout, they're also having brain inflammation at the same time. And then foods contaminated with pesticides, and foods, of course, contaminated with herbicides. So what are examples of foods that are gluten mimickers or can be gluten mimickers? So the list is quite extensive. And some of these I was actually quite surprised to come across too. So we know that the different types of casein in milk proteins will often mimic gluten. So your body thinks that you're taking in gluten. Amaranth for some individuals can be a gluten mimicker. Buckwheat, even though it's not a gluten per se. Corn, and most of us now know that most, or if not all, corn now is genetically modified anyway. So all types of cow's milk and cow's milk products like cheese, yogurt, and so on. Ice cream, of course, would fall into that category. Eggs are unfortunately a gluten mimicker. So if you have a patient that's having serious digestive issues or brain issues, then eggs would certainly be something you might want to consider removing from their diet. Hemp for some people can be a gluten mimicker. Milk chocolate, not to be confused, with dark chocolate, of course. And millet, oats, unless, of course, you're looking at gluten-free oats, although they are suggesting that maybe about 1% of the population might be sensitive to even the gluten-free oats. So that's something to keep in mind as practitioners. Potatoes can also be a gluten mimicker. Quinoa, particularly especially the white quinoa. So what would be exempted would be the red and the black quinoa from that. Instant rice like rice-a-roni, success rice, those are examples of instant rices. Rye, barley, spelt, and wheat, of course, as you all know, those are certainly gluten-containing grains. Sesame seeds, and that would include tahini. If somebody's using tahini in making, like hummus or some sort of a bean dip, so that's another food or seed that can be a gluten mimicker. A lot of brands of pre-packaged, pre-ground, and instant coffee can also be a gluten mimicker. Sorghum, which is often used in gluten-free products, as it is considered a gluten-free flour, for some individuals, they might react to that. So that's another thing to look at. Soy, of course, we know is a gluten mimicker. It also contains high amounts of glutamates, which can actually be very damaging to the brain. Tapioca, often also used in gluten-free products, can be a gluten mimicker for many people. Teff, which is the Ethiopian bread, often called injera. Even though it's fermented, for some people, that could be also a gluten source, a gluten mimicking source for them. Whey protein for many individuals will often create gut inflammation and possibly brain inflammation. Yeast for many patients too. And most nuts, with the exception of Brazil walnuts and pecans, can also be gluten mimickers too. What are other hidden sources of gluten? So typically when you're reading food labels, anything that has artificial food coloring could be a hidden source of gluten or a gluten mimicker. Dextrins, food emulsifiers, food stabilizers, often these are used in mayo and horseradish type sauces and condiments, so those need to be looked at carefully. Malt extract, flavoring, syrup forms, modified food starch. Of course, soy sauce if it's soy-based, and other similar sauces like teriyaki, to give you another example, which also contains soy. The exception would be coconut sauce now, that is often used as an alternative to Bragg's aminos or soy sauce, like the other types of tamari soy sauces that are out there. So when an individual or patient has a gluten sensitivity, that they may not be aware of? What are some of the neurological complications that can result from that gluten sensitivity? Well, amazingly, it's numerous. We know that hearing loss, something as simple as just having hearing loss, could be a neurological complication from gluten sensitivity. Migraines, movement disorders, MS or multiple sclerosis, and other types of neuromuscular diseases, multiple system atrophy, neurological autoimmunity in the brain, different types of neuropathies, psychological disorders, even restless leg syndrome. Even with working with many of my patients that have restless leg syndrome, a lot of them will report beyond, giving them additional minerals like potassium, magnesium, and so on, that often going on a gluten-free diet is enormously helpful to them. Cognitive impairment, dementia, and also ataxia, which is an incoordination of muscles. So it's a lack of voluntary coordination of muscle movements. So these can all be complications from gluten sensitivity, undiagnosed, of course. This is a fascinating slide of a patient that had a gluten sensitivity and was actually, his primary complaint was actually headaches. So if we take a look at the brain MRI on the left side, if you see all the white matter there, that white matter is actually an indication of gluten sensitivity and headaches compared to the normal study on the right. And a lot of times when individuals will go on a gluten-free diet, if you were to do a repeat brain MRI, you would actually see a lot of those white matter start disappearing. So it's pretty powerful. So we all understand that sugar is harmful when taken in excess, but do many of us understand the impact on the brain? In recent years, they've discovered that there is an issue with sugar in the brain. It's called type 3 diabetes or brain diabetes, it's often referred to as. And this is a gluten resistance that actually causes chronic inflammation throughout the body, leading to insulin resistance. So the insulin resistance is actually going on in the brain. So what happens is the brain does not produce enough insulin or is actually resistant to the insulin it is producing. And this often will happen mostly in people who already have type 1 and type 2 diabetes, but in a small part of the population, they can also develop type 3 diabetes without having either type 1 or type 2. And sometimes it's misdiagnosed as Alzheimer's disease, actually. So in diabetes 3, the brain cannot produce sufficient insulin for new memory formation. And without the insulin, those insulin receptors die. And without the insulin receptors, the brain cannot form new memories. Also, the neurons in the brain are unable to respond to the insulin, which is essential for basic tasks, including memory and learning. So the insulin is really critical in the brain to form new memories. But again, it's all about the balance. So another cartoon, resistance training is just as important as cardio. Train yourself to resist chocolate, pastries, fried foods, beer, and pizza. So how does the gut tie into the brain? And, how do we get the connection with the gut causing brain inflammation? Well, we need to look more closely to what is termed leaky gut syndrome. So the leaky gut is referred to as a malabsorption problem that occurs in the bowel or the intestines or the lining of the gut. Typically, bacteria, viruses, and undigested food particles, as well as toxic waste products, can leak from the inside of the intestinal tract through the damaged digestive lining and into the bloodstream. And from the bloodstream, they're transported throughout the body and can trigger an immune system reaction. So we can see how the leaky gut can actually occur in the sinus and the mouth, where the individual develops a lot of frequent colds and has serious food sensitivities. In the brain, leaky gut syndrome can manifest as depression, anxiety, ADHD. In the skin, acne, rosacea, eczema, psoriasis, these are all indications of leaky gut syndrome. The thyroid, it's often the autoimmune thyroid, Hashimoto's, or hypothyroidism, or Graves' disease, which is the overactive form of thyroid. In the colon, constipation, diarrhea, or irritable bowel, disease can be another indication for leaky gut. Leaky gut can also affect the adrenals, causing significant fatigue. And in the joints, often with rheumatoid arthritis or fibromyalgia and headaches, there's definitely a link with leaky gut. So what are the mechanisms that can cause leaky gut? Unfortunately, there are several different mechanisms that can really trigger leaky gut. So all these different parameters need to be looked at when we're treating our patients. The first one, of course, diet is one indication. Hormonal effects as well, infections, particularly in the gut, but infections can be elsewhere systemically as well that can create the leaky gut. Medications that a lot of our patients could be on, particularly things that they're taking on a daily basis, metabolic dysfunctions, neurological trauma. And in addition to neurological trauma, I would also add, of course, specifically abdominal trauma too. Stress, and we'll certainly look at that in more detail. And then many of you are very familiar with vaccines. We now know that vaccines can also trigger not just leaky gut issues if they're oral vaccines, but in many ways brain damage as well too, as is often seen in certain types of autism. So let's first take a look at the diet aspect of leaky gut. So alcohol is a considerable contributor to leaky gut and highly damaging to the gut and to the gut lining. Also, particularly alcohol in excess, and actually in excess means a glass a day or more. So alcohol should be limited to 1 to 2 glasses a week for everybody. Casein, of course, as we mentioned earlier, in milk, particularly in milk products, excessive sugar and starches, fast food, gluten, and then of course the processed foods that we had talked about, which would be instant coffee, instant oatmeal, rice-a-roni, success rice, those types of foods as well. Now, if we take a look at hormonal aspects that can cause leaky gut, now we understand that hormones are produced in the intestinal tract. Particularly all 3 estrogens are. So estradiol, estrone, and estriol, all 3 of those forms of estrogens are produced in the gut. The healthy gut bacteria will promote the production of good estrogens, which is estriol or E3. That's the protective estrogen that protects us against all forms of different types of cancers. And it also helps in reducing symptoms of menopause and osteoporosis, whereas unhealthy gut bacteria will produce the unhealthy estrogens, the 4-hydroxy forms and the 16-hydroxy forms, which are not healthy, whereas the 2-hydroxy form is the safest form of other types of estrogens in the gut. Also, other mechanisms of leaky gut, infections. So when we're looking at infections, bacterial overgrowth, some of you are familiar with that as candida or yeast infections. That's a significant contributor to leaky gut. Also SIBO more recently, which is the small intestinal bacterial overgrowth. It often develops actually in small bowels, when it should really be only in the colon. And unfortunately, it's not just one bacteria that causes SIBO in the patient. It is a multitude of various bacteria, and that's why it's often a very complicated, complex type of condition to really try and treat in many of our patients. More recently, they have found that SIBO is not just about bacteria, but it's also the interaction of unhealthy estrogens in the gut that actually interact with toxic compounds that can also be a significant causative factor for SIBO. H. pylori, which can often be picked up from, poor hygiene, like in water and food, intestinal viruses, parasitic infection, and again, the yeast overgrowth. So taking a look at medications, the ones that we know for sure can be a trigger for leaky gut, antacids, since those are often taken once a day at minimum, in many cases sometimes twice a day. Antibiotics, particularly the frequent use of antibiotics, but even a one-time dose that's taken for a long period of time can be sufficient in a weak individual to cause leaky gut. Corticosteroids and xenobiotics. Now, what's fascinating about xenobiotics is that these chemical compounds can also be from other types of drugs or medications, but they can also come from pesticides in our food or could potentially be a carcinogen. And that too will often trigger a leaky gut reaction. Other metabolic dysfunctions in the body, autoimmune conditions. Some of you may not be familiar with advanced glycosylated end products, AGEs, as we often term it, which creates intestinal inflammation. What AGEs is proteins and lipids or fats in food that become glycated as a result of exposure to sugar. They are a significant factor in aging and in the development or worsening of many degenerative diseases, such as diabetes, atherosclerosis, chronic kidney disease, and, of course, not to be forgotten, Alzheimer's disease. These harmful compounds are formed from cooking foods at very high temperatures, and they accumulate in the body as people age, and they're a major cause of this type of inflammation. And it will often increase insulin resistance as well. So neurological trauma, some good examples of those would be neurodegeneration from lifestyle and poor overall habits, stroke, of course, and then other types of brain trauma too. So let's take a look at how stress can also trigger leaky gut. The increase of catecholamines and cortisol when the individual is highly stressed, and also the corticotropin releasing hormone that's released by the hypothalamus when the body's under severe stress. And then, of course, many of you are familiar with the post-traumatic stress disorder or PTSD, and that over time can also be a significant contributor to leaky gut. And finally, we come to electromagnetic fields and the impact they have on the brain. So perhaps in today's world, the single most destructive environmental factor on the brain is electromagnetic fields. And this is becoming increasingly a concern, particularly with children as they start to use cell phones and keep the cell phones close up to the ear. As you can see in the picture that I have up on the screen, that direct contact of electromagnetic radiation will actually heat up the brain and cause serious damage over time. So what can we do to help with the electromagnetic radiation that's around us? Well, one factor in preventing it and reversing some of the damage that's done by electromagnetic radiation, it's not going to completely reverse all the damage, unfortunately. But one of the most important hormones that can do this actually is melatonin. So if you do not have a sleep issue, then at least take melatonin to protect your brain from electromagnetic pollution and radiation that's abundant everywhere. So where is melatonin produced in the brain? It's produced in the pineal gland, and it is the most important or the best antioxidant to protect our brains. from brain inflammation and brain damage. Far stronger than vitamin C and vitamin E actually put together. The other significant advantage to melatonin is that it does have neuroprotective effects in the brain. So it is a significant factor in slowing down and reducing brain aging. And one important thing I might want to add is that with melatonin, you do not want to use a synthetic source of melatonin. When you use a synthetic source of melatonin, it will shut down the brain's own ability to produce its own melatonin. So it's very important that the melatonin you use is a non-synthetic and ideally made from probiotics. And sleep as well at helping protecting the brain from aging. Sleep deprivation is probably one of the greatest factors in brain aging and probably the #1 issue that we have in today's society. People are highly sleep deprived. We need at least 5 consecutive hours of uninterrupted sleep in a dark room, a dark bedroom. So you don't want to have any lights on, not even a light that comes from a clock near you or your cell phone light. Make sure that the room is as black as possible and that it is also properly remediated. No TVs in the room, no Wi-Fi on in the house. When you sleep at night, all of these will make a significant benefit in helping with promoting deep restorative sleep. So, let's turn to stress again. Why does stress affect us? How does it impact the brain? We now understand that stress causes a variety of negative impacts on the brain. Chronic stress activates the adrenal cortex, which releases cortisol, and the adrenal medulla, which releases the epinephrine and norepinephrine. High levels of cortisol can overload the hippocampus, disrupting a person's sleep cycle or circadian rhythm. Cortisol will also hamper the Papez circuit in the brain, which controls our ability to learn and remember. And this is why when we all get stressed and the stress is chronic, we sometimes realize that, oh no, we can't remember things and we have these memory lapses. So we've all experienced that to some degree. So chronic stress comes in 2 different forms and the way that it impacts the brain. We have the psychological stress impact on the brain, and we also have a physiological stress. So let's take a look at the differences within those. With the psychological stress, for many individuals that work excessively, particularly if they do not enjoy their job. I mean, there is a difference when you work excessively, but you enjoy what you do, and yet you also have an outlet or have some downtime. But when the excess work is something that you're not enjoying, that creates significant psychological stress on the brain. Also, not having a stress outlet or any kind of downtime will create tremendous stress on the brain. Lack of job satisfaction, as I mentioned, lack of sleep, of course, social withdrawal, also unhealthy relationships. So all of these are examples of significant psychological stress. So let's take a look at physiological stress. Physiological stress would be anemia. Anemia is very damaging, not only to the thyroid, but also to our immune response. And also autoimmunity will often create a lot of physiological stress on the body. We mentioned Hashimoto's, but autoimmunity could also be rheumatoid arthritis. Diabetes type 1 is actually considered an autoimmune condition. And more recently, they're considering type 2 diabetes as also being an autoimmune condition as well. Chronic infection on the body will trigger physiological stress. Chronic pain, insulin resistance, and type 3 diabetes or insulin resistance in the brain, food sensitivities, and of course, any type of systemic inflammation. So last but not least, what impacts our ability to have healthy brains is brain trauma. And unfortunately, sports-related brain traumas will often trigger Alzheimer's and dementia later on in life. Also accidents, those could be sports accidents, but they can also be car accidents and other types, like a slip on the ice as another type of accident. All these are examples of accidents that can trigger brain trauma. Even if you slip on the ice and you don't fall on your head, but you fall on your tailbone, we now understand that how much damage that can trigger to the brain. So with multiple brain traumas, the second impact syndrome, or SIS as it's often termed, is when a second concussion causes the brain to swell rapidly before the symptoms of the first concussion have subsided. It most often leads to death and severely disables most of those who survive. And some interesting actually statistics on sports injuries, particularly research that was done at Boston University's Chronic Traumatic Encephalopathy Center, but they have come out with statistics that more than 3.5 million children ages 14 and younger get hurt annually playing sports or participating in recreational activities. Although death from a sports injury is rare, the leading cause of death from a sports-related injury is usually brain injury. And many of us are familiar with Muhammad Ali, the well-known boxer who later developed Parkinson's disease. He had tremendous concussions and brain trauma to his head as a boxer. So, of course, that's unfortunate that had occurred. And recently, a study in neurology concluded that greater later life cognitive impairment was associated with ex-NFL players who participated in tackle football before the age of 12. So what can we do to heal brain trauma? We have a lot of options that we can use and utilize in day-to-day life to really help treat and reverse brain trauma. So some examples would include exercise, deep breathing, meditation, mud packing, and yoga. And in March at the Quantum Summit, I will present in more detail in each of these areas. But let me at least review the impact of exercise and brain health. With exercise, the positive neurological effects that are caused by exercise can never be replicated by any medication, botanical compound, or nutritional supplement. Exercise causes the release of a brain-derived neurotrophic factor, BDNF. It is critical to perform a variety of different physical exercises to both stimulate and challenge in order to maintain a healthy brain. Even walking for as little as 20 minutes daily can improve insulin resistance to the brain. Exercise has a direct impact on growth hormone that allows the brain to recover more quickly from any trauma. So going back to the brain-derived neurotrophic factor, BDNF, the reason why that's significant is that it allows the neurons to establish connections between each other in the brain. And this process is essential for healthy brain activity. So when we have a depressed BDNF level, we are much more prone to having a serious brain-related injury. Also, outside of physical exercise, brain exercises are critical to reducing brain trauma and preventing brain aging. And these examples would be crossword puzzles. If you're doing any computer games, Lumosity would be one of them that would be extremely beneficial for brain health. Learning a new language where you're challenging, stimulating the brain to produce new neurons, playing chess, and then also learning new dances, which can be a fun thing to do. Taking a look at emotional health, researchers have found that in general, people have healthier brains when they have gratitude in their life, when they have love in their life, they have positive attitudes, and also social interaction. And just to give you an example of what each of those would mean, gratitude is actually the quality of being thankful. It's the readiness to show appreciation for and to return kindness. Positive attitude is an outward manifestation of a mind that dwells primarily on positive matters, so no negative thinking. And many centenarians, those who live to over 100, have all been found to have in common these qualities. They have a positive attitude, they have a healthy, clean living lifestyle, they exercise on a regular basis, and they also have faith that everything will always work its way out, and they always believe on the bright side of all situations, no matter how sobering a situation might be to them. And then, of course, the social interaction. We are social beings, and it's very important for us as humans to maintain healthy social interactions with people. Deep breathing. Here's an example of someone sitting cross-legged and doing what we call alternate nostril breathing. So alternating the inhalation through one nostril and then exhaling through the opposite nostril and then reversing that is what alternate nostril breathing is. And the deep breathing helps to calm the brain down. And many of us know that meditation is beneficial for stress reduction, but do we understand how it works? So we know that meditation is about helping us to be fully awake in our lives and to see things in the present moment. So when we meditate on a regular basis, we have a clearer picture of who we are ourselves and also of those around us, and we have a better understanding of the intricacies of life. And for healthcare practitioners like ourselves, mindfulness meditation has been found to help reduce stress, anxiety, even burnout. And it also enhances our resilience as healthcare practitioners too. So what are some of the age-defying effects of meditation? The human brain begins to decrease in volume and weight around the mid-20s. Can you imagine that? As early as the mid-20s, and continues throughout life. So this can progressively lead to functional impairments in the brain. It can also lead to an increased risk of mental illness and neurodegenerative diseases as well. Meditation can slow, stall, or even reverse age-related brain degeneration. And of course, meditation needs to be practiced on a regular basis. They have found that even as much as 3 times a week can be very significant in helping our brains. And yoga. So there are so many different types of yoga out there. There's power yoga. There's so many different types of flow, vinyasa yoga, and so on. So we're talking here about the slower types of yoga where you're holding the postures, more like hatha yoga. So one mechanism by which yoga can help the brain is that it influences the autonomic activity. And yoga practices can stimulate the vagus nerve that runs from the abdominal area all the way up to the brain and to the brainstem. And it can enhance the parasympathetic output, leading to parasympathetic dominance and enhanced cardiac function, mood, and energy states, as well as a balanced neuroendocrine, metabolic, cognitive, and immune response too. So there's really a lot of value to encouraging our patients and clients to do yoga on a regular basis to really get a tremendous benefit in all these areas. So now let's take a look at supplements for brain health. So we have some herbal suggestions. Herbal supplements can lessen the effects of stress on the brain, and these would include ashwagandha, rhodiola, phosphatidylserine, and phosphatidylcholine. And these supplements support the brain, the adrenals, the hippocampus, the cholinergic, dopaminergic, and GABAergic and serotonergic systems. So it has a balancing effect on all the different systems in our brain. And other supplements that can significantly support brain health would include DHA, zinc, matcha, and green tea. Amino acids like glycine, acetyl L-carnitine, NAC, branched chain amino acids or BCAA, alpha lipoic acid, which is a very powerful antioxidant for the brain, calcium bentonite clay, not to be confused with sodium bentonite clay. The majority of clays out on the market these days is the sodium bentonite clay, which has nowhere near the benefits of the calcium bentonite clay. Glutathione, NADH, CoQ10, and PQQ, as well as vitamin D3. More and more research is indicating the benefits of vitamin D3 as being neuroprotective. And with that, I would like to thank you all very much for your attention this evening.